I spent my college years studying chemical engineering, and it didn't take long for me to find that I wasn't really interested in smelling refineries and chemical plants, so I went into the food business. My first job, and I learned a lot over the course of that career. I worked for several companies, and what I'm going to do today is tell you some of the things that happened to me that I observed that tells me that people who suggest we have too many government regulations and we should eliminate them and set industry free to do as they will are absolutely wrong. That is a very self-interested position to take. And when people say such foolish things as our president has said that we should eliminate 2 rules every time we make a new one, it sounds okay, but only if the 2 rules that you eliminate shouldn't, times have changed or they were bad rules to begin with or something like that. But there's a book downstairs in my reading library about I think it's Filters Against Folly. And one of the things when you're faced with an idea is you have to see first whether it's well described. Is it described in intelligent terms so that you can understand what they're actually saying? The second filter is, do the numbers add up? In other words, quantities of anything, good, bad, or indifferent, come in various amounts. So if you don't know any of the arithmetic, it's hard for you to evaluate whether this thing is good or bad. And the third filter is, if all this worked out, what happens later? All right, so let's look at that. We'll eliminate 2 regulations every time we make a new one, and then that will be really good. Well, the math would suggest that very shortly, how many regulations you have now, whatever number that is, as you create new ones, the number that you have remaining goes down, 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 until you only have the last rule you made. And so do you really think that would work out in the long run, to have no rules? It really is inconsistent with a complicated technical society to suggest that that's true. So that idea fails on only the description is valid, the arithmetic doesn't work out, and what happens then is a total disaster. In my opinion, things started to go downhill when this country, running every now and then a little bit of a budget deficit every year, paid down the debt we ran up during World War II till it was almost nothing compared to our size of our economy. And an actor named Ronald Reagan ran around the country saying, the government isn't the solution, the government's the problem. And things have been going downhill pretty steadily since then. But my first job was at Quaker Oats Company. It's a cereal manufacturer. You well know what it is. They're not as big as they used to be. And I was working in process development in the R&D labs where the new cereal products or pet foods or whatnot were being developed by cereal chemists and other people. And my job was to look over their shoulder, see what they did, and develop the machinery and the processes to make that on a scale that you could market. So it was right there where a lot of nice things were going on. And Quaker Oats, as many other companies, wanted to engage their employees in what they're doing and brag about themselves. So they got us together in small groups, 20 or 30 in a room, and they would explain all about the company and their history and how good they were and how proud we should be that we worked there. So one of the things they did to prove this is they listed on a board all the products that Quaker manufactured, what they had projected their sales would be next year in each of those products, and how much profit they would make on each of those products. And then at the bottom there was other, that there was no plan for, and there was no quantity, and there was a pretty big number, a lot of profit out here. Well, I told you at last service that I am a curmudgeon. Curmudgeons ask questions when they're faced with new information. And my question was, what about other, and how can we do this better job on that one next year? Exactly what is that other? And here was the explanation. The explanation was that is profit we didn't anticipate making because it was due to unanticipated price increases made during the year in order to meet our competition. And the curmudgeon raised his hand and said, "Isn't that called price fixing?" And I can tell you that the guy running the meeting immediately went on and asked somebody, called on somebody else to ask a question. I was pleased that after I thought about what I'd done, I was pleased that my boss never ever mentioned it. It seemed that maybe he didn't understand how rude I had been and how correct I had been. But what I learned there is what people need to know today. You don't have to have, in order to have a conspiracy, you don't have to have something written down. You don't have to have some agreement ahead of time. If you know your business and you know your competitor's business, you can pretty much predict how they'll react to things you do. And they can predict how you react to things they do. And in the cereal business, the deal is anybody raises their prices, they all raise their prices. There's nothing written down in an agreement. It's just a conspiracy in their heads, and that's the way it works. And I suggest that that's not a testament for suggesting that we need less government regulation. When I left Quaker Oats, I went to a small dry corn milling operation in Milwaukee. We ground 55,000 bushels of corn every day and turned it into smaller pieces so that those pieces could be separated out into bran and corn germ and corn oil and various corn grits or corn flour or all kinds of products. These things ended up in wallboards and breakfast cereals and all kinds of things. One of the products we made was sold to the government, and we were not the only manufacturer of that product. It was called CSM, corn soy milk mixture, which was a product made for infant feeding. The US government bought it from these companies and shipped it all over the world in brown bags that had clasped hands on them and said, "A gift from the people of the United States" underneath it. And if we have any soft power left in the world, it's probably from people who remember that. But there were several companies manufacturing this product, and they did, in fact, get together and conspire to fix prices. I don't know exactly what that write-down was, but owing to government accountants, they actually had it all laid out, and they knew exactly how this was done, just from looking at all the contracts we were given, all the bids, and all of that. And so he came to our plant one day with a bunch of sheriff's people, and they confiscated all the files from the engineering department, all our drawings, everything, because they were going to prove that the justification that the company had used for their price increases, in fact, didn't exist, that costs hadn't changed and whatnot. They definitely proved this. They sent Charlie Krause to jail, that was my boss, because it was the second time they caught him price fixing. Howard Lahoff at Lahoff Mills went into his office and shot himself. So the people at Illinois Cereal and some other companies that were involved in this, they just got heavy fines. But Charlie Krause went to jail. So is that a time for us to suggest we need less government regulations? Private enterprise needs to have their handcuffs removed so they can really be productive? I don't think so. Well, when your boss goes to jail, I thought it was time to leave myself. So I found myself another job in a small company in western Wisconsin that manufactured milk replacers, basically coffee whitener. But this is for animal feed. But it's basically powdered milk, some form of fat, coconut oil or soybean oil or whatever you want to use, and whey protein or casein from milk, which is the protein part of milk. We manufactured that basically for animal feed. Now at that point in the dairy industry, cheese whey was a drug in the market. No one knew what to do with it. They were dumping it on fields, they were dumping it in creeks, any way they could get rid of it. So this little company fed into that and started using all this whey, turning it into calf milk replacers, pig milk replacers, wonderful thing. Well, the government And so government does have regulations that don't work, and those are the ones that should be changed. But in order to support farmers, the government had been buying excess powdered milk and storing it in warehouses. So finally the warehouses are bulging and they gotta get rid of this stuff. Well, what does a politician do? They think well, we've gotta get rid of this milk. How will we do it? So they go to the feed manufacturers and say, if you'll buy this powdered milk from us that we paid farmers $1 a pound for, we'll sell it to you for 50 cents if you agree to use it for animal feed. All right, that won't disrupt the powdered milk market. So my company started buying truckload after truckload of this powdered milk from the government, paying them 50 cents a pound for what the government paid those farmers $1. Can you spell socialism yet? Well, in order to be sure that this powdered milk did not get back into the powdered milk market, when a truckload of this stuff arrived, you got a USDA inspector who went around with a little injection machine and injected anise oil in the end of every bag on every pallet, so that would flavor that powdered milk. And you know, you don't use anise oil in a lot of recipes, all right? So there you go. Well, I can tell you this. I was the engineer, I was the plant engineer, and they had me construct a thing that was 2 bins side by side with a grate over the top, and in the middle was a great big 3-cornered blade sticking up. So as soon as the USDA inspector left, it was all hands on deck. Every one of those bags got taken up, lifted up by somebody, and slammed down on that blade. They cut that bag in half. And the half that had the anise oil went into this bin, and the half without the anise oil went into that bag. Pneumatic conveyor took this to a bagging machine, right back into powdered milk bag. This one, that conveyor took it to our mix room where we slurried it up with water, ran it through our spray dryer. All the anise oil evaporates and goes out in the air, and that powdered milk goes back into the powdered milk. Some of that powdered milk probably ended up back in the government warehouse that they bought from the dairies for $1 a pound. So this is just incredible. That wasn't good enough for them. That wasn't good enough for them. The company found that they could buy casein from New Zealand and Ireland very, very inexpensively. They could bring it to the United States and use whey from the guys who were removing lactose from whey, so they could spray dry the whey proteins that were left over. So they buy this casein, they combine it, they blend it with lactose, blend it with this spray dried whey protein, and it looks the same constituents as the powdered milk. All right? But it's a little bit different. So they sell this stuff as powdered milk to people who, well, whatever. One of the big customers was a company called PH Orth in Wisconsin. You may have heard of that company. They make all kinds of bakery mixes, cake mixes, all that stuff you find in the bakery aisle. We sold them a lot of this powder. Sold it to them cheap. And the problem with it was, depending on who used it, what you did with it, its functionality wasn't the same. So a lot of cakes fell, a lot of stuff didn't really work out, and PH Orth got a lot of lawsuits, and they lost them all. So I was not at this meeting, but I would love to have been there. But my good friend, the treasurer of the company, was, and he said, Doug, it just warmed the cockles of your heart. He said, Bill Merrick said to those guys from PH Orth who wanted him to pay all those lawsuits, said, no. He said, you knew something was wrong with that milk when I sold it to you. You knew damn well there was something wrong with it. I sold you $1 a pound powder for 80 cents. You're as guilty as I am. And he said, yes, you're right. We did know there's something wrong with it. And here's the difference. You're either going to pay for it or you're going to jail, because nobody can prove that we knew that. And so all the money that Bill made by cheating pretty much went out the window. Poetic justice, if there ever was. But there you have a company doing things that needs more government regulation, not less. Not less. Then I made a hasty decision. I finally got tired of watching this go on. And I applied for another job, and it was for a company, small engineering firm that made the equipment that removed lactose from whey so that the whey proteins could be spray dried. So I go there, and at that time, this whole industry, there hadn't been found good uses for lactose. And so all of these cheese factories had a warehouse that was filling up with bags of lactose. Well, this company I went to work for was in the business of manufacturing and selling the systems that produce this lactose. So my first 3 weeks I was at this new job, every time the owner's phone rang, it was somebody canceling an order. Well, he just knew that the way the business was going, he certainly didn't need another salary, and that was me. But he was a very religious man. He was a Baptist. He was a pillar in the church. He was really a well thought of guy, and he prayed about this. And after he called me in and fired me. And so after I left, there were only 2 other employees, a secretary and a draftsman, who called me up and said, "Hey, Doug, we want to take you to dinner before you leave and whatever, to say goodbye." They were decent people. So I go to dinner with them, and they say, "Oh, you know what Kent told us after you left?" "No, I don't. But I suppose you're going to tell me," and they did. Said, "Kent came and told him that he had to fire me because he prayed about the business, how bad it was, and he said, God told me that Doug is Jonah on my ship, and if I don't throw him overboard, I'm going to sink the whole damn ship." So that gave me new respect for established religions, which I haven't quite gotten over, but that has nothing to do with government regulation, however, so that's sort of an aside in this presentation. Well, leaving that company was not a decision I had to make, but I was out of work for 6 months. It's tough to find a job when you don't have one, particularly when you have to say, I got the last guy I worked for fired me. But I finally ended up at Gelida, south of town, as a process engineer, process control engineer. Probably one of the better jobs I've had. They didn't hold the fact that I'd been fired against me too much. And I can tell you that that company, to my knowledge at least, if they fiddled around doing things they shouldn't have done, I was never aware of it. They were far more straightforward, honest company. One thing that did happen that I do know is when we were purchased by that German company, we had lots of German people over here then, management people, working with them. And I was not at this meeting, but a guy I know very well was at a sales meeting in which the discussion was, we can ship gelatin to Japan for food, but not for photographic purposes, because Fujifilm was not interested in having our gelatin mucking up their market. And one of our salesmen suggested that we label our Fujifilm, our photographic gelatin, as if it was food, and then we could export it to Japan. And the Germans there came down on him like a stink on shit and said, "No, we don't do that stuff. We don't do that." And that's the only, other than that and the way they operated other things I'm aware of, that company is fairly straightforward, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed working for them a great deal. And then I get old and had to retire. But as a matter of fact, all of those experiences would demonstrate that if you don't have government, you don't have civilization. And people everywhere have to deal with this human nature. And we all have temptations, and we have to know how we're going to react to those things ahead of time, or we're unsure. And that's why we need We need traffic laws, otherwise we would drive differently than we do. And we need all kinds of other rules and regulations. So the question on government isn't whether this government should not have the power to produce regulations and they ought to be eliminated. The problem with government is that in order to have one, you have to give them some power. If they have no power, they can't do anything bad because they have no power, but they also can't do anything good. So and that's with individuals as well, to the extent that we have individual power, it's that power we have that allows us to do bad things or good things. So that's the issue with government regulations, are the reasons for it. What would we do? How would we live? What would society be like if we had government regulations? Well, there are things like building codes. Definitely raises the price of a house because we have building codes. Electricity have to be installed in a certain way. Plumbing has to meet certain requirements, structural things. You have to have a light switch within arm's reach of every door you walk into, and all kinds of things. Which one of those rules do you want to eliminate? When you hear about an earthquake in Pakistan or Bangladesh, you find out that 50,000 people died because their houses collapsed. That doesn't happen here. As a matter of fact, there will be new building codes for those areas where the hurricanes keep talking to. There'll simply be different rules for building houses there. And because of those rules and regulations, you, when you buy a house, have some confidence that it's going to stand up and it's going to function, it's going to perform, all of that. Recently, we have Boeing that has been given more ability to look over their own shoulder rather than have the FAA look over their shoulder. And so they produced a 737 MAX and killed a few people. Because every game needs a referee. Everybody needs somebody watching them. And this didn't happen just yesterday. It's happened for a long time. Years ago, the meat industry was a horrible place. It was corrupt. It was terrible. I forget the guy's name, but he wrote a book called The Jungle about that industry. It was absolutely horrible. This is why the government, which had the power to pass some laws, manufacture the USDA out of whole cloth, have them inspect those meat plants, and those kind of problems disappeared. When I was a kid even, there were still people going around to county fairs selling snake oil medicine. And the FDA, we need the FDA to look over the shoulder and get those things off the market and make those people quit doing those things. You need a government with some power to do those good things. Now, the fact is that the government can do bad things. That's our job, to watch that government then. They also need some oversight. And that's where democracy kicks in. And that's why we should spend a lot more time worrying about those things than where or when or what it's going to be like when we go to heaven. Because we can't get any productive enterprise out of that. Because regardless of the conclusions we come to, it won't change 1 iota what's actually going to happen. But what happens in this world, in this earth, where we buy our groceries and all that stuff, what we do matters, and what our government does matter. Currently, it's easy to find people who will tell you you shouldn't listen to Hollywood people interjecting their ideas in politics because they're just actors. But I would like to remind those people that they are the very ones who elected Ronald Reagan, who was nothing but a grade B actor, who went around the world, went around the country. All he could do, he was an actor. I don't think he had any brains. He read speeches that were written for him by General Electric all over the country. That's all he did. And we elected him president, and he cut the taxes and started to increase the deficit from day one. In addition to that, Congress passed a law that told him he was to spend no money to influence the revolution that was going on in Nicaragua. So he gave weapons that taxpayers had paid for to Israelis, because there's enough people that think anything you do for Israel is wonderful. But the deal was Israel sold these things to the Iranians, and the Iranians shipped the money back to the Nicaraguan Contras, and that's history. He should have been impeached. Our first active president absolutely should have been impeached. So government is we need it, but we need to watch it. And remember, I read this before, I'll read it again, from the Declaration of Independence. These truths, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's why we need a government, because these guys who we think were geniuses and we think were almost saints said so. They told us so. They didn't tell us, don't watch the government. As a matter of fact, the rest of this Constitution exactly said all the restrictions that they put on this new government, so they couldn't do this and they couldn't do that, and they couldn't just crap all over some minorities. So government does things that are terrible, but we need a government because they have the power to do good things as well. To demonstrate that, to prove that, we have a problem on our southern border, and one of those problems is there are a lot of Guatemalans that want to leave that place, because it really is, even our president, the only thing he ever said that was truthful, there are shithole countries in the world, and Guatemala is one of those. And there's a book downstairs that you can borrow if you sign your name and put a card in a box. It's called Bitter Fruit, and it tells you the disastrous story of how the United States government interfered continually in Guatemala to make sure that their favorite dictator stayed in power, and that any attempts to have a democracy down there would fail. That's the reason those people are in misery. That's the reason that society is terrible. That's the reason why they're trying to leave. And now we don't want them in here but we don't recognize the impact that our policies had on that. Iran, in the news now, horrible place, evil people. You were all old enough to remember, as I was, when the Iranian students took over our embassy. And in listening, talking to friends and reading the newspapers, I thought I was the only one in the United States that knew that the United States in 1952, our CIA under Kermit Roosevelt, I think the grandson of TR, helped foment a revolution in Iran. The Iranians had thrown out their dictator, shipped him out of the country, elected a democratically elected parliament, elected a prime minister, the guy's name was Mossadegh, and he decided that he was going to charge the British oil company a little more for the oil because he saw no reason why the Brits should be getting rich and the Iranians should stay poverty-stricken when they had all this oil. Well, obviously the British oil company didn't like that, and so they tried to have a revolution of their own in Iran to throw this prime minister out and get the Shah back. But the prime minister wasn't stupid. He immediately shipped every Brit, expelled him from the country, so there's nobody there to pay off whatever, you know. You gotta have somebody on the ground in order to get something done. So they reacted wisely to that and just threw all the Brits out. Unfortunately, they didn't throw out the US, and so the US oil companies simply stepped in, CIA, Kermit Roosevelt, Shah's back in power. Now he'd been thrown out once. He wasn't gonna let it happen again. So how do you do that? You have a police state. And made every Iranian's life miserable for 40 years, and they all remembered that it was us that did it to them. So those Iranian students, when they took over our embassy, had every reason to do so. And Iranians today have every reason to not like what we're doing in the Middle East. We don't understand that. We just don't understand how power gets used and how it gets misused, and we somehow are so egotistical that we think that anything we do is right, and it's not. Our government needs us to watch it a lot more carefully than we do, but that does not mean that we don't need government and that we don't need government regulations. There's no government of note in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Niger. They are all shithole countries. because they have no government. They don't have any institution with enough power to help. That's it. I think that, I hope you read some of these books that I've got downstairs. I had some, the FDA, we had some regulations. You may remember this. Thalidomide was produced to give to women to prevent spontaneous abortion. It turns out it's diethylstilbestrol. If you don't like chemical names, then that's another one you can hate. At any rate, it didn't even do that effect, but our FDA tried to keep that out of the country, and it did it for many years, but finally, you know, there's government regulations holding our hands. We can't sell thalidomide in the United States. So by the time it came to the United States, was when it was well known by then that it caused birth defects. Now there's a guy that I met in Elway, Wisconsin, who was a minister, in fact. Had one finger and one thumb on each hand. He was a thalidomide baby. Because the FDA didn't want that thalidomide in the United States. They knew it was a bad thing, but they lobbied Congress, got it in because private industry, magical private industry, that happened. The shirtwaist factory fire, that was in the recent news. I just saw it again. This is a clothing factory on like the 8th or 9th floor building in New York that had a disastrous fire and a lot of people were killed. They were killed for several reasons. One of them was this private industry that doesn't need all these government regulations, didn't like their employees going outside on fire escapes and getting a breath of fresh air, so they locked the doors. So they couldn't get out. And then there was no regulation because private industry can do anything they want. So they built a 9-story building, I think it was 9, it could have been 8, whatever, in a town that the tallest fire truck is only 3 stories short of that. And so now you have people locked up there, fire trucks that can't reach it in a big fast flash fire, and then die. You need government regulations. You need somebody to say, you can't build a building in this town that's taller than we can provide these other services, do these other essential services. We need government. I mentioned Boeing 737 MAX. My dad worked at Ford Motor Company before they were allowed to unionize. And when Ford suspected anyone of promoting a union, he hired local crooks to come in his plant, beat them up and toss their ass out on the street. If you got injured in the plant, so like you lost some fingers and now you can't do your job, they beat you up and tossed your ass out on the street. This is no lie, this happened. Until the government passed rules that said workers can negotiate and organize. They have to meet certain requirements from the National Labor Relations Board. That was a good thing the government did. It was not a bad thing. It was not a bad thing when the government instituted our workman's comp programs so that companies that had bad safety records would pay higher insurance premiums and so forth. Those are things that we need government for. If you eliminate government from that and just leave it up to private industry, they will make you pay for buttermilk. They'll do all kinds of things. You cannot trust. Every company has an auditor on their books. Why? Because they know people can't be trusted without a referee, without a policeman. We need government regulations. We need to watch our government closely. And now we have another song, or
Yes.
Or we do the song before the other reading.